Now, yesterday, Camilla, we received an email from the lovely Will Farmer from Rugby in Warwickshire, praising the podcast. Thanks again, Will. We hope you're listening again today. He mentioned his dogs,
Yes.
which are Lhasa Apso. Is that how you say it? I'm not even sure that's how you say it, Camilla, to be absolutely
Isn't a
honest with you.
Lhasa like a drink in India?
That's a lassie.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so maybe similar to that. I hope I've pronounced those correctly, Will. We did ask yesterday for a picture of Piper and Penny, and Will, God bless you, has provided one, and you can go and look at it on our socials.
Indeed.
X or indeed Twitter, as I insist in my one-person battle against Elon Musk. I'm calling it.
And at Daily Tea Podcast, folks.
Little question for you, Camilla. I don't know the answer to this. Are you a dog or a cat person?
Now, we used to have a Springer Spaniel called Purdy.
Oh.
As you can imagine, Kamal, as you once described me as gun-toting, that is the
didn't
name
shoot
of the gun maker.
Oh, right.
Purdy makes shotguns.
I thought you were going to say you
out in
shot
the
your
country.
dog.
No, of course not. Do you know what? Actually, it was tragic. That dog was stolen.
No.
Yeah.
In the
it was
roads of
dog-napped.
Hertfordshire?
Yeah, in Harpenden. And my father was absolutely devastated.
God, I live in crime-ridden London.
Indeed so. And then we moved on to cats, and I've had a succession of cats, and the current cat inhabiting Tominey Towers is Baroness Lionel of Blair. Lionel for short. Strange because when we got her, we thought it was a boy, and then we realised it was a girl, and then we realised that Lionel Shriver exists, and she's a woman who's named after a man. And, of course, she's an aristocrat because she just likes to do her own thing in her own way, occasionally troubles us for some food, occasionally troubles us for some love. Baroness Lionel of Blair. Once tap danced back in her day, but now very much confined to her little box where she sleeps probably for about 23 and a half hours a day.
Ah, well, that's a nice lot of sleep that she gets. We have a dog, Snowy, and I'm a dog person. He's also getting on a little bit in years. Bedlington Terrier. Very, very sweet.
Do you look a bit like your pet? Because this does happen. I'm just looking at your grey flecked hair and I'm thinking
Actually,
Snowy.
you're right. Snowy started off quite white-haired and he's become greyer as he's got older. I started with very deep brown hair and that's also got greyer as we've got older. So yes, I'm getting more close to the looks of Snowy.
Great.
Shall we move on to the
Yes,
President
shall
of the
we?
United States?
Shall we move on? Dog-owning President Biden. Has he got a dog?
He does.
The Obamas had a dog as well.
Does he have a dog? I'm looking to the gallery. The dog has bitten people, we're told by Lillian, one of our producers.
Right. Well, there you have it. As long as the president isn't biting people, although there is a debate, isn't there, about whether the tail is wagging the dog in America.
Let's get into that.
Let's get into that. Keir Starmer is off on his first international trip to Washington and the Nato summit to mark the alliance's 75th anniversary. And of course, they'll talk about defence and global security and Ukraine. But is the conversation really going to be focused on these topics when the only thing, at least the White House press corps wants to talk about, is Joe Biden's health? That, of course, comes 10 days after he struggled, and let's be honest, Kamal, he really struggled, in that now infamous TV debate with Donald Trump.
Making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
That, Kamal, has only served to fuel the fires when it comes to journalists asking questions about whether Joe Biden is fit for office. There's been this incredible row. I mean, it's funny how the American press actually deal with the White House spokespeople, and it's a kind of quite combative process anyway. Boris Johnson tried to introduce a similar system here and it didn't really work. But this idea of the press corps going into a room and firing questions at the person speaking on behalf of the president is the way that they've done it over in the White House for decades. But things became rather heated because journalists in America are quite rightly asking serious questions about Joe Biden's cognitive abilities, how many times a doctor has been in to see him. Kamal, all this has done is fueled the fire of journalistic inquiry, really, into the president's health.
And what the voters want to hear about. It's the big discussion. Is the 46th president of the United States really able to stand for another 4 years?
And what's difficult about it is medical conditions and, you know, where legitimate journalistic inquiry ends and privacy kicks in, questions have been asked about why one particular doctor, a man called Dr. Kevin Cannard, has been into the White House 8 times in the last 8 months, because he's a neurologist. And he works at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, and he specialises in conditions including Parkinson's. So journalists over in America have been asking, why does he keep on coming into the White House? The White House then decides to publish a letter by the president's actual physician, a guy called Dr. Kevin O'Connor, to address this claim of, why has this guy been in and out? Has he been assessing Biden for different neurological conditions? Dr. O'Connor has said, no, he's coming in and out because he's looking at all White House staff. Don't read too much into it. And indeed, President Biden's cognitive function has been tested. He's got great fine motor skills. We haven't detected anything wrong with him cognitively. Parkinson's has been ruled out. But as we'll hear now in this clip of the latest White House press conference, reporters aren't convinced.
This clash is an amazing listen because Jean-Pierre is a massive character in America. Her briefings are seen coast to coast and are watched by millions. And this clash has got to the heart of this issue about Biden's health.
So I am telling you that he has seen a neurologist 3 times while he has been in this presidency. That's what I'm saying. I am telling you that he has seen them 3 times. That is what I'm sharing with you, right? So every time he has a physical, he has had to see a neurologist. So that is answering that question.
No, it's not.
No, it is. It is. You're asking me.
I cannot.
But I also said to you, Ed, I also said to you, for security reasons, we cannot share names. We cannot share names.
You cannot
we
share
have
names
to. We have to.
Others he would have met with.
We
But
cannot.
You can share names in regards to if someone came here in regards to the president.
We cannot share names of specialists broadly, from a dermatologist to a neurologist. We cannot share names. There are security reasons. We have to protect.
It's public.
I understand that. I hear
He's
you.
right there for anyone to see.
Ed, I hear you. I cannot from here confirm any of that because we have to keep their privacy. I think they would appreciate that too. We have to give them.
The doctor.
We have to keep their privacy.
It is public information.
I hear you.
And you're going to allow this to fester longer, Karina, unless the White House answers the question.
Hold on a second. There's no reason to go back and forth and be in this aggressive way.
Miffed around here about how information's been shared with the press corps about him.
What are you missed about? What are you missed about?
Everything he just asked about.
And then every time I come back and I answer the question that you guys asked.
Correctly, then have to come back and clean it up.
I never answered the question incorrectly.
Goes to the heart of that point that you make, Camilla. What is the correct boundary of health information the public should get and privacy? And in America, it's much more open than it ever would be in the United Kingdom. But it is remarkable that this debate is going on just 4 months away from the presidential election, so questioning the health of one of the candidates. What Biden has done has really attacked back. He has said literally that the only person who can judge whether he is ready to serve again, which he believes he is Lord God Almighty. We think as well Jill Biden, his wife, will play a role in any decision he may make, but it's certainly looking like he wants to fight for that election on November the 5th. He sent an open letter to Democrats in Congress. And then he did this rather remarkable thing, Camilla. He used a page from the Trump playbook where he calls into MSNBC, a well-known Democrat-leaning, obviously big channel in America, and got this rather confused response from the presenters because they didn't know this call-in was coming.
Now for something a little different, and from inside the White House, we have a special guest joining us now, the 46th President of the United States and presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden, calling in to Morning Joe right now. Good morning, sir.
Hey, Mika, I'm more than presumption. I'm going to be the Democratic nominee. One, to make sure my instinct was right about the party still wanting me to be the nominee. And all the data shows that the average Democrat out there who voted, the 14 million of them that voted for me, still want me to be the nominee, number one. Number two, the idea that Donald Trump has gained in any substantial way his argument to why he should be president is anywhere convincing than it was 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago. It's just not there. And we're just getting...
He's not actually enunciating his words that clearly. I'm
No.
not sure how convincing that approach is for voters. But just going on to his own battle with his own party on whether he can be the next nominee, he's done a whole series of video calls. This has become an issue around who supports Biden within the Democrats. Joe Biden has a long and, for many of his supporters, noble history of supporting black congressmen and black congresswomen and black voters in America. And he's really leaning into, for example, the Congressional Black Caucus. One of those congressmen, Cedric Richmond, the former New Orleans congressman, has come out behind Biden. And it has become this almost racial division. Cedric Richmond said, I think it's interesting that not one African-American member of Congress has called on the president to step down. And he said that the white lawmakers, as he described them, that they risk alienating some of their base, i.e. Democratic voters, by abandoning Biden. So this debate has now become a debate around African-American representation, who is their allies, and is it only white congressmen and white congresswomen who are coming to say Biden should step aside?
But this is now, as you said, this is now taking a leaf out of the Trump playbook. You know, the elites are trying to bring me down.
He said this thing about the elites,
What's he talking about? Because the counter-argument to that is, quite cogently, that it's the elites that are keeping him in place against the better judgment of, yes, his own Democratic supporters. But I don't quite see this distinction. You know, so far no black congressmen have decided to speak out. You know, maybe that's just because none of them want to put their heads above the parapet. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with race relations in America. Also, this is having a bad impact on his poll rating. So we now see Trump ahead in those 6 key battleground states that you have to win in order to become the next president. So that's just to remind you, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Arizona, Wisconsin and Nevada. And that poll lead now ranges from between 1 and 6 points. I think it's for Trump in Nevada particularly. It's at its highest. The other problem, of course, for the Democrats is they have no plan B. I mean, it's all very well saying that the default position would be to install Kamala Harris. She's widely unpopular, even in her own party. She's lampooned online. Did you see the video of her constantly repeating this phrase that she's got? So I think it was James Woods, the Hollywood actor who's very much in the Republican, not Democrat camp. And he put together or stitched together, or at least recirculated, somebody had stitched together all of these different occasions when Harris has said the phrase, what can be unburdened by what has been. And it's this weird phrase that she repeats literally in every interview or public address she makes. So she's now become a sort of Democratic version of Sarah Palin, this figure of ridicule. You can argue that there may be some misogyny at play in all this, but she's not given a very good account of herself. You look at some of her speeches, she speaks in total word salad. Nobody can quite follow what she's saying. And then meanwhile, this doubling down and this saying, I'm not going anywhere. Don't you think that almost compounds the problem for Biden? He's like fast resembling everyone's sort of grumpy granddad on Christmas Day, refusing to cooperate. It's like the stubbornness seems to be a symptom of the disease.
It's certain that Keir Starmer will obviously play an incredibly straight bat. You go into these situations. I remember when I was political editor at the Observer newspaper, travelling with Blair when he went to see George W. Bush. Actually, a lot of those ahead of the Iraq War. And they're incredibly choreographed. So although the conversation in the sort of public sphere, what's going on in the press, what's going on with voters, what's going on in the Democratic Party, will be very loudly about Biden's fitness for the future, or the discussion that Keir Starmer will be involved in, and he will stay absolutely in his lane. You have these choreographed events, you have the big flags. It's going to put Keir Starmer on a different type of stage, one that he's probably not used to, but he will be advised by the Foreign Office, by the US embassies in both the consulate in New York and also the embassy in Washington on how to behave in these things. And I imagine he will be quite interesting to the Americans, because he will be one of the few what might be described as left-leaning leaders still left in Europe, and what kind of relationship does that mean they will have? David Lammy has already come out strongly about the issues in the Middle East and independence for the Palestinian state as part of a two-state solution. And obviously, of course, David Lammy will be travelling there, and he's got his own history with Donald Trump.
And yeah, Biden will be quite happy probably to meet David Lammy and Keir Starmer, thinking that they also probably side with their colleague Sadiq Khan in being highly critical of Trump. And in fact, actually using some pretty strong language describing him in the past. What did Lammy say? That he was a white supremacist and wasn't fit for office himself and all the rest of it. That will at least ingratiate the Biden camp with Starmer. The problem, of course, Kamal, is going to be if Trump does take power and how those subsequent meetings across the pond might go, but that's for another time. Shall we bring things back to Blighty?
Let's do that.
Because it's a big day, isn't it? It's a big day for all of the newly elected MPs who have arrived in Westminster, most of them probably not knowing where on earth they're meant to be going. It's a labyrinth, even for those like you and me who have negotiated those dusty corridors for some years, to turn up there fresh from your constituency where you may have won your vote overnight on Thursday and then pitch up and try and find your office and get your pass and your security codes and all the rest of it sorted is quite complicated. Also, the complexion of the House of Commons now, Kamal, you've got the Tory party literally just crammed into one end of the green benches, depleted in number. You've then got all of these Lib Dems in with Sir Ed Davey, 72 of them. The SNP, a much smaller showing for them, just 9 MPs. Those pro-Palestinian independents perhaps didn't expect to be there, but they number now 5. 5 Democratic Unionists, 4 Greens, 4 Plaid Cymru, and of course those 5 Reform MPs, including Nigel Farage, who we'll speak about in just a moment.
Yes, just the weight of numbers on the Labour side and the fact that they will swap sides in the House. That incredible picture where for the last 14 years we've seen Labour. If you look at your television screen, you'll see Labour on the left-hand side, the opposition benches, and you'll see the Conservatives on the right-hand side, the government benches. That swaps over, and suddenly you are seeing the literal physical manifestation of the transfer of power. Now, not quite as many seats for Labour as Tony Blair got in 1997, but still they will be crammed in to those government benches, which will give that image of how much Labour won by.
Worth pointing out, by the way, that we won't have a Prime Minister's questions until the state opening of Parliament, which is on July the 18th.
And also, this huge majority still came with, I think, the lowest share or the second lowest share of vote for any winning party in modern British political history, which I think is something around 33.7%. So huge majority, quite low vote share.
We've seen so much of Keir Starmer, understandably, haven't we, in the last 5 days? He is now the Prime Minister. I think it is a kind of stark reflection of how irrelevant you become in opposition, that we've not seen or heard anything from Rishi Sunak. He's still the interim leader of the opposition. He's announced a shadow cabinet. I mean, it basically happened without any fanfare at all. Suddenly it was like, oh, he's announced his shadow cabinet.
When you looked at the Telegraph this morning, I think it was sort of a down page piece on sort of, page 6 or something.
Yeah, by the way.
Yeah, there's just this little story, and it is just that idea that somebody who is so powerful, less than a week ago, Camilla, is now relegated to almost the news in briefs because he's shuffled around a few people who now really don't matter.
They don't really matter. So he's stuck to type, really. He's reappointed the ministers that he had before, those that are left anyway. So we've got Jeremy Hunt back in as Shadow Chancellor, Oliver Dowden back in as Shadow Deputy Leader of the Opposition now, Victoria Atkins at Health. I mean, they've had to do a little bit of moving around of the deck chairs on the Titanic. It should be stressed, though, Kamal, I mean, the interim nature of it, we've got Suella Braverman and other leadership hopefuls out on manoeuvres, saying different things. But I think actually, to be fair, they are listening to Ian Duncan Smith's advice on this podcast on Friday. Can everyone just take a period of reflection and pause. Let's not go over the top yet. Let's just think about why this has happened and what we can do to prevent further bloodletting. So we are going to have this strange period, particularly for Sunak, where he's basically in limbo, can't really move on.
Has Suella Braverman got that memo, do you think, Camilla? She's appearing on an awful lot of programmes, I think, including your own.
I interviewed her on Sunday, and I said to her, come in and flex your muscles and let's see what happens. And I expected her to nail her colours to the mast and say, yeah, I'm definitely running. Then she did this strange thing of sort of, what do you call it, catchy monkey. What's that phrase where you sort of like ducking and diving? And I was going around the houses and I was having to say to her, I got into that thing, Kamal, where you're speaking to somebody and they just won't answer a straight question. So then I start going, can we just leave it like this? Are you saying that you're not going to rule out running as leader? Privately, we both know she's going to run as leader, but she's holding her cards close to her chest.
There'll be an important point today. The 1922 committee, which is the representative body for backbench Conservative MPs, they're going to elect their leader today, and they will be important in managing the process. I think we imagine, don't we, Camilla, that this is going to be a process which will run for a number of weeks at least, if not a few months. But they're going to have to make a decision by the autumn. And there has been some reporting in the Telegraph and elsewhere that if it's not done by the autumn, Rishi Sunak wants to resign as leader and go back to the backbenchers. He doesn't want to be the leader of the Conservative Party for months and months and months and months.
I'm running a poll on my Twitter/X profile. I've pinned it to the top if anyone wants to vote. But of the righties so far, and we've got 6,148 votes in. So of the righties, I put Kemi Badenoch, Suella Braverman, Priti Patel and Robert Jenrick in there. Braverman is leading, 48%. Kemi, second place, 24%. And then Jenrick in third place. So not much love for Priti Patel out there, at least among my Twitter following. And then of the centrist, that's interesting. Nobody seems to want Victoria Atkins, but Tom Tugendhat and James Cleverly are both tied at the moment on 44% each. I'm going to keep that running for another 6 days. When Lucy Letby was convicted of the murders of 7 newborns and the attempted murders of 6 more in August 2023, she was described by the judge as having led a cruel, calculating and cynical campaign of child murder in plain sight. Earlier this month, Letby was convicted of another attempted murder, a charge on which the original jury had been unable to reach a verdict, confirming her status as Britain's most prolific baby serial killer. When she was sentenced last August, she was the 4th woman ever to be handed a whole life tariff after Rose West, Myra Hindley and Joanna Dennehy, the Peterborough ditch murderer. For the families of her tiny victims, the outcome of this tragic case has been bittersweet. They say the conviction of the 34-year-old they trusted with the care of their precious babies will never take away the extreme hurt, anger and distress they have suffered. This was their family liaison coordinator, Janet Moore, speaking after her initial convictions.
Words cannot effectively explain how we are feeling at this moment in time. We are quite simply stunned. To lose a baby is a heartbreaking experience that no parent should ever have to go through. But to lose a baby or to have a baby harmed in these particular circumstances is unimaginable. Over the past 7 to 8 years, we've had to go through a long, torturous and emotional journey. From losing our precious newborns and grieving their loss, seeing our children who survived, some of whom are still suffering today, to being told years later that their death or collapse might be suspicious. Nothing can prepare you for that news.
Yes, truly unimaginable. That clip given to Sky News. An inquiry has now been opened into how the NHS handled the case, and there are going to be hearings this autumn. But now, and a special report in the Telegraph today, new questions have started to emerge about some of the scientific evidence that was used to convict Letby. Our science editor, Sarah Knapton, joins us now in the Daily Tea studio alongside our crime editor, Martin Evans. Thanks so much for joining us. You've written this deep investigation with our colleagues Sophie Barnes and Will Boulton. Just take us through initially the why and some of the genesis of this piece.
Well, I think what was very unusual about this case from the outset was that, unlike most murder cases where it's quite clear that a crime has been committed, right at the outset, it wasn't clear in this case whether any crime had been committed. There were a series of deaths on a neonatal ward. Tragically, babies on neonatal wards do die. They're vulnerable and they have health complications. But the statistics around this suggested that there were more deaths here than there ought to have been. Right back in 2017, when the police started to look at this, it wasn't clear whether or not they were investigating a crime. That was the first thing they had to establish. When eventually they did conclude that there had been crimes committed, they then had to think the unthinkable and accuse one of the people who is there to look after the babies, to make them well, had to accuse her of being responsible for their deaths. So I think that's why this case has been unusual from the outset.
And of course, Martin, you covered at least part of the trial. Obviously, we had a whole team who were there throughout the many, many days of that first trial and the second trial. How have these questions come about now? What type of questions are we looking at?
Again, because this was such an unusual case, there was no forensic evidence. There was no CCTV footage. There were no witnesses who had seen her in the act. So from an investigative point of view, this case was very much based on circumstantial evidence. And much of that circumstantial evidence was based on science and what the professionals or the medical experts were able to suggest to the jury had happened.
So Sarah, as science editor, let's bring you in on this, because you've written this piece and you've identified some questions being asked about particular moments of evidence. So we could have a general conversation, and we will in a future podcast actually sort of look at the whole picture of that particular neonatal unit, the pressure that staff were under, and the premature nature of the babies and how ill they actually were. But what you've identified in this piece is doctors coming forward and just raising concerns perhaps about the robustness of the evidence that was heard in court. The first point that you raise is on the use of pattern data. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence against Lucy Letby was this chart basically spelling out in quite conspicuous black dots the fact that she was always on duty when a number of these babies died.
So I think the chart, which basically showed that Letby was at every murder and every attack, was really crucial in flavouring the further evidence. That was kind of almost the base layer from which all the other evidence built from. And the real problem with that is there were other deaths and probably collapses. We don't know the collapses. We only know extra deaths happened during that same period, which were not included in that chart. And there's a phenomenon called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. And the idea is if you take a machine gun and just fire it at a wall, you could then find a cluster of bullets somewhere on that wall, draw a ring around it and say you were a great shot. So that could be what's happened in this case, because there was no other deaths plugged into that chart. It appears that Letby's present at all the deaths. Obviously, she's going to be present at those because they're the ones she's being tried for. So it felt like a very selective chart that was shown to the jury, which we now know that you can take that same death rate that was happening across the hospital at the time and put any nurse in just through random into that same amount of deaths just by complete chance.
The second plank of the work you've done has been around the issue that the prosecution said that Lucy Letby had injected air into the veins or stomachs of babies in her care, which caused these irrevocable collapses. Again, just as with the statistics of this pattern of her being present when the deaths occurred, the evidence around this air embolism has also been questioned. What have you found out about that?
So the prosecution experts had never seen air embolism, which is quite interesting. They were relying really on scientific papers showing what the effects would be. And one of the problems with that is there aren't many cases of it. It's a very rare condition. And they did come across one paper which suggested that when it happens in babies, you get this very blue tinged skin because the skin isn't getting oxygen, essentially. And then this sort of pink blotches on top. And they said that had happened in some of the cases, and that was really one of the main planks for saying that it was air embolism. Now, the problem with that is that the paper they relied on, which was from a very famous neonatologist based over in Canada, he has now come forward to say you can't use that paper in that way, and that actually the specific patterning that you should have been looking for was pink veins sticking out on a blue background. It's not just this sort of blotchy, mottled effect that the prosecution said was present. That wasn't an indicator that air embolism was there. And I think that's a problem. And actually, that doctor came out, he came forward to talk in the appeal and to say that shouldn't have been used. And that was dismissed in the appeal. And the appeal judges basically said they should have called him earlier.
Okay. One other part of the case that you've highlighted, Letby was also accused of attempting to murder 2 babies by poisoning liquid nutrition bags with insulin. Tests were never actually carried out on the contents, but the prosecution relied instead on blood samples from the babies. Again, that evidence has been called into question, Sarah.
One of the problems with this evidence is they never tested the feed bags, so they don't actually know there was insulin put in them, that they were never tested. They only tested the blood of the babies, and yes, the insulin had skyrocketed in their cases. One of the issues with that is that the test they used shouldn't have been used for forensic reasons. They did the test in a clinical lab at Liverpool, and it really had no evidential value whatsoever. And the second point is that when insulin starts out its life, it's a sort of pre-hormone called proinsulin, and it breaks down into 2 things, which is one's insulin, the other is this substance called C-peptide. Now, you should have equal levels of those substances in the body if you've got natural insulin forming. In the cases of these babies, the prosecution argued there was no C-peptide or very low levels of C-peptide and very high levels of insulin, which suggests that insulin's synthetic, it's been put there, it's not naturally occurring in the body. But the problem is in one of those cases, the C-peptide levels were pretty normal. And we found an insulin expert to say that really shouldn't have happened. Well, we found 2 insulin experts to say that just it doesn't ring true with if that had been synthetic insulin, you would have got no C-peptide at all there.
We should be clear, of course, and as we said in the opening, she has been convicted in 2 trials of murder and attempted murder. As you say, Sarah, her appeal has also failed. But these are important questions of the use of circumstantial evidence, as you say, Martin, which the inquiry will have to look at. One other fact or one other data point that we should also understand is that since Lucy Letby was removed from her post in 2016, when the investigation started into her behaviour, the number of deaths at that neonatal unit did decrease.
I mean, it's a difficult one, this, isn't it? Because you've got families of victims here clearly completely distraught. I mean, no conviction or verdict is ever going to enable them to get over the loss of their newborn children, Martin. We know that questions have been raised in an article by the New Yorker as well over in America, that during the period of the retrial we couldn't publish over here because it would have amounted perhaps to contempt of court. I note from the piece that you've written together that while there are doctors saying, look, this does seem to not be conclusive and I've got problems with this and this could be perhaps be undermined by that, nobody is saying categorically a huge miscarriage of justice has happened here. Letby's innocent, are they? They're saying she probably did still do this.
Yes, I mean, interestingly, when I was at the retrial a few weeks ago in Manchester, there were a group of what I'd describe as Lucy Letby supporters who were in court. These are members of the public who are obviously well informed on the evidence and believe that she's innocent, and they're all wearing these little yellow butterfly pin badges, which is taken from a pin badge that Letby was wearing in a photograph that showed her before her conviction. I think there are members of the public who are concerned about the evidence. The scientific community have concerns. I spoke to a criminologist, Professor David Wilson. His view was that, was justice done? Probably. He said he couldn't go any further than that. I think it's such an unusual case, this, because there was never any smoking gun. In most murders, there is DNA evidence, there's CCTV, there are witnesses. There's a whole raft of things that can persuade a jury. This case was very unusual because you're asking the jury to convict a young woman of the most horrendous crimes imaginable without that smoking gun, without that DNA evidence. And I think, it was a 10-month trial. The jury spent many weeks deliberating and came back with lots of guilty verdicts. Though it's important to say she was found not guilty of 2 of the charges, and there were a number of charges that they couldn't reach verdicts on, but the majority of the charges were guilty verdicts. But I think those questions will always remain because of the fact that there wasn't that smoking gun, that really compelling piece of evidence which absolutely convicted her.
Look, it's important, isn't it, that we still do the journalism, even though, as you say, Camilla, there's such sensitivity around this case, because in future cases, this stuff is going to come up again. Circumstantial, scientific evidence, how do we test that? I know there have been some changes in the Netherlands after the data patterns were used in evidence against in a health case. So it's important for the inquiry this journalism continues. So look, thank you, Sarah and Martin, and also our colleagues Sophie Barnes and Will Boulton, who have done, I think, a service to journalism that is important. These questions are tested, and then we see where we get to in terms of, as you say, Camilla, not really innocence, but certainly what's the robustness of the case.